truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, September 6th, 2024, the 1325th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so yesterday we talked about the launch of Russian collusion hoax number 2. The news networks broke their live, already breaking news coverage to go to a live breaking news event. The fake and illegitimate president's attorney general gave a press conference at a task force meeting. On his left was Chris Wray. On his right was Lisa Monaco. And after the cable news coverage cut to Merrick Garland, but before he addressed the ostensible subject matter of that press conference and task force meeting, he rolled out a series of 3 affirmations about the official story within the central narrative as it was being released on Wednesday. He let everybody know that there was a threat of domestic political violence, not by leftist rioters in the streets of cities around the country, looting stores, burning down neighborhoods. That was all summer of love stuff in 2020. Not that kind of violence. No, violence by Trump supporters against election officials. Just one way they might choose to interfere in the election. They're going to intimidate election workers. Then they're going to make a big story about election workers being intimidated. Then they will create moral and legal structures that are ostensibly designed to prevent any election worker from being intimidated, and that's going to include no one criticizing any election worker and no one ever being allowed to watch what election workers do. Then he let us know that the fake and illegitimate president's Department of Justice, which he leads, is going to do everything in its power to make sure that justice is done when it comes to the school shooting event down in Winder, Georgia. Today we were told that the shooter was bullied for being gay. And if that's the case, since gay people are a protected class who don't operate with their own personal agency, it was the bully's fault that the gay shooter staged this school shooting event. And now that they've made this threat, if you bully gay people, we're going to shoot your children. Once they've seeded that idea and tended to it, and watered it, and allowed it to sprout, then they'll begin building a moral and legal structure to punish anyone who says anything that could be taken as homophobic. Because the last thing you need in times like this is bullied gays going around and shooting everybody. And you're not going to let us take your guns, so we're just going to agree to settle for censoring you. Now, I know people immediately made a long-term emotional commitment to this story. And that is the point of these stories. They are designed to force you immediately to make a long-term emotional commitment and then exact emotional punishment and reputational punishment on anyone who doesn't make a long-term emotional commitment to these stories immediately. But as I said yesterday, whenever any of these traumatic events occur and the regime and its media immediately begin pushing a political agenda they were already pushing, you have to understand that the point of the story is to exploit it for political ends. Any social pressure or punishment for you to think and act a certain way about that story is invalidated by the fact that they are already pushing politics. So if you chose not to take the 24-hour or 48-hour or 72-hour rule, then you've put yourself in a bad position. Not because anyone can be certain that nothing bad happened. Something bad may well have happened. But the problem is, if you've allowed the trick to work on you and you get emotionally invested and they can get everyone back on the same page, then they are already drawing you back in. And that's why the repetition of the official story was added into the introduction to that press conference right after the cable news broke to the press conference. Then Garland got into the case involving Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, and Dave Rubin. The claim is that their new company, Tenet Media, received $10 million from foreign actors who, as part of their agreement, were going to have final say over some of the content these three and their partners produced. They claim that they had no idea the money was coming in from a foreign actor, and we have no reason not to believe them. The bigger problem for them, and the one we should be focused on, is that they are saying what they're told to say by whoever pays them. They are also people who have admitted publicly that they will shy away from certain topics completely in order to preserve their platforms and reputations. It's better not to be saying what you're told by anyone, not adjusting your speech, not falsely presenting what you actually think to comply with censorship standards. That is a form of lying, and they admit they're doing it for money. They admit that they accepted the incentive and punishment structure not only from the platforms, but socially in the party of false decorum. I'm not denying they would get punished. I'm not suggesting that they should get punished. I'm just saying that is a choice. They knew about the choice. They made the choice for a certain reason, and they're not dishonest about the reason. They admit clearly that they will not tell the truth if it might risk them money or reputation. They are committed to the party of false decorum the same way they're committed to the scientific materialist belief system. But here's the thing, and I talked about this yesterday. Our foreign government funds propaganda overseas. And they also fund propaganda here in the United States. They have given themselves permission to propagandize to the American citizens using their taxpayer money. In fact, they pay it out to influencers on the internet to disseminate their messages. They did it throughout 2020, whether it was about COVID or Black Lives Matter and the Summer of Love, whether it was about mail-in balloting and Zuckerberg drop boxes in the fake election, through the big lie, through the insurrection. They are paying influencers to distribute these messages and make them look popular. So our government propagandizes foreign countries, our government propagandizes us, and our government itself is part of an occupying foreign entity, literally doing the business of the global regime through politicians totally controlled by the Israel lobby at AIPAC and other foreign interests, their speech controlled by the Israel lobby through the ADL. So what we really have, at least to the extent that any of this is real, is the American government enforcing a standard in a case-by-case basis, making the decision based on which foreign country we're dealing with and what sort of view is being expressed. And then once Garland got through those 3 introductory issues, he got to the actual, or at least ostensible, subject matter of that press conference turned breaking news television event. Again, pressing the idea that Russia was attempting to interfere in our elections by setting up fake news sites that people don't visit. He outlined a propaganda campaign that likely had little effect on anyone, if any effect at all. And naturally, ironically, just as the story calls for, he ignores the fact that all of American media is propaganda, and the parts that aren't propaganda are censored in violation of the First Amendment. And if you're confused still about whether or not the government is involved, whether or not the government's doing it, here's the fake president's fake vice president pretending to be on a presidential campaign yesterday and making it abundantly clear that she plans to censor. Here's what she said in a performance before the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And maybe we should just pause and think about whether or not I am racist for reading the whole name of this organization as it appears on the signs behind Kamala Harris, because it is in fact racist to say colored people. And whoops, now I've said it twice. You have to say people of color so that it's not racist.
Will put the Department of Justice of the United States back in the business of justice. We will double the Civil Rights Division and direct law enforcement to counter this extremism. We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms, because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
Now, that is some of the most deranged commie nonsense you will ever hear. What definition of justice was she using? She's saying she wants to put the Department of Justice on the project of creating racial justice in the United States by whatever subjective standard they choose to use at any given time. Once you say we are creating justice, you have given yourself license to do everything. It's like a war on drugs or a war on terrorism. Drugs are so bad we're justified in doing anything we need to fight this war. Terrorism's so bad we're justified in doing anything we need to fight this terrorism. Justice is so important, we are justified in doing anything we need to create justice. And if you think our methods are unjust, well, we're just evening out the unjustness of before. That's how we become unburdened. She goes on to grant herself another subjective standard: hate speech. If you spread hate speech online, or you allow hate speech to be spread online, we will hold you accountable. And then she went on, as a community. What does that even mean? First off, there's no such thing as hate speech. There is such thing as hateful speech, but that's certainly not confined to any race or any political party. And it's awfully hard to take serious coming from a woman who, as a preview to her NAACP speech, filmed a barbershop scene in a fake barbershop by renting 8 barbershop chairs and inviting some black guys to tell her how they believe a special set of rules needs to be written for the blacks, as if all black Americans are a monolith hanging out in barbershops asking for a different set of rules. It's weird, isn't it, what the anti-racists choose to highlight? It's like they're trying to create more racism or something. But to return to the prior subject, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General under the fake and illegitimate President Joe Biden, a man who should not possess any legitimate authority whatsoever, wants you to know that MAGA supporters, the violent ones, they're going to interfere in the election by intimidating election officials. And there was another school shooting. You know which side is for school shootings and which side is against them, don't you? I mean, Merrick Garland and his pals are the ones who want to confiscate guns in direct violation of the Second Amendment, but they're only doing that to make sure there are no more school shootings. And because you don't want to let them do that, it's your fault there are school shootings. And that's just part of you being a violent MAGA extremist who might then go intimidate election workers in order to influence the outcome of the election. And then, Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and Benny Johnson, sure, they're liars, grifters, frauds, and cucks. But all sides have agreed to label them as conservative podcasters and influencers. So you have to know that all of those MAGA extremists are getting their ideas from somewhere. These are the most conservative podcasters and influencers. So the MAGA extremists are getting their ideas from these people. And it turns out these people are actually just disseminating the ideas of Russia. And they didn't let anyone know that they were acting as foreign agents. And they say that they didn't know. But come on, someone's got to know. Didn't someone check? Was it their conservative benefactor, Lauren Chen, who owns Tenet Media with her husband? Are they the ones who didn't check to see whether this money was coming in from evil Russian oligarchs? And again, I have no love for any of these people, but it doesn't sound like they should be guilty of a crime. Merrick Garland is presenting a predicate that they will use to strip away more natural rights, more constitutionally guaranteed rights from the American people in a time of crisis. They want you to give away your First Amendment. They want you to give away your Second Amendment. And you are definitely not allowed to question any public officials. Everything they are accusing others of, they do themselves, but it doesn't matter. That's how important it is to keep Donald Trump out of office. The only way he can get in is through MAGA extremists, mis and disinformation online, and propaganda campaigns, election interference campaigns waged by foreign nations. Now, when I was going through this yesterday, even before I did the episode, I shot a message over to my pal John Harold, also known as Patel Patriot, and I said, in 2020, when John Ratcliffe came out and gave that press conference with Christopher Wray, the FBI director, and Chris Krebs of CISA, didn't the Uniparty communists lose their mind, claiming that John Ratcliffe letting the nation know about foreign influence in American elections leading up to the election was itself election interference? He was calling into question the validity of their election. And no one's allowed to do that because it is very important that absolutely everybody believes they're participating in real elections. If people realize that they're not participating in real elections, well, then the legitimacy of the government begins to fall away, and they can't have that. Ratcliffe let the country know about the threat of foreign interference into our elections, and they called that election interference. This is from rollcall.com from October 22nd, 2020. The headline: Ratcliffe's warning on foreign interference with U.S. voters provokes skepticism. The director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, in a hastily assembled news conference late Wednesday with FBI and Homeland Security officials, said that Iran and Russia had managed to steal voter registration information and were targeting voters, spreading disinformation intended to harm President Donald Trump. But Ratcliffe's warnings immediately drew skeptical reactions from Democrat lawmakers, some of whom had been briefed in private about the interference. They specifically disputed that the actions by Iran were intended to harm Trump. Instead of listening to Ratcliffe, the House Homeland Security Committee said in its Twitter feed that Americans should listen to FBI Director Christopher Wray and Christopher Krebs, Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Wray and Krebs stood with Ratcliffe at the Wednesday evening press briefing. Now, that committee is led by Benny Thompson. Benny Thompson is saying, do not trust the Director of National Intelligence under Donald Trump. You can only trust the Director of CISA and the Director of the FBI. He said Ratcliffe has too often politicized the intelligence community to carry water for the president. And roll call includes comments from a range of Democrat communists. Chuck Schumer said, I had the strong impression it was much rather to undermine confidence in elections and not aimed at any particular figure. Nancy Pelosi said, I think we have to be very careful about any statements coming out from the intelligence community 13 days before the election. Chris Van Hollen said, one of the real tragedies of the Trump administration is that they have corrupted some of our institutions that have been, for the most part, sort of insulated from partisan politics. Oh, how does that happen? Oh, it's because of the uniparty, and no one actually wants to provide oversight over these quote-unquote institutions. As a result of that corruption, he says, they've put at the head of DNI a political hack who does the president's bidding, and that's what we have, sadly, in John Ratcliffe. The article ends citing a former station chief of the CIA named John Cipher, who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times where he claimed that Ratcliffe already put himself in the running to be considered among the most destructive intelligence officials in U.S. history. And that is for telling the American public that there was foreign interference in their election in the lead up to the election. It was too close to the election, they say, for the Director of National Intelligence to let the American people know that someone was trying to mess with their election. It's too close to the election. They might actually believe that our elections aren't real. But they also tried the same thing at the end of August that year. And that attempt may explain why Ratcliffe simply said all of this aloud at a live press conference. This is Fox News on the 30th of August, 2020. Ratcliffe defends halting election briefings, accuses members of Congress of leaking classified information. And guess who he's talking about there? Why, it's Shifty Adam Schiff. Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe defended his decision to scale back in-person election security briefings to Congress in favor of written reports and accused members of Congress of leaking information within minutes of briefings. In an interview with Maria Bartiromo, he said that he had been going above and beyond in briefing, quote, not just the oversight committees, but every member of Congress, end quote, but will no longer do so. He said within minutes of one of those briefings ending, a number of members of Congress went to a number of different outlets and leaked classified information for political purposes to create a narrative that simply isn't true, that somehow Russia is a greater national security threat than China. Adam Schiff accused the Trump administration of pushing a false narrative to downplay Russian interference in the 2020 election. They're going to put it in writing now instead of giving an oral briefing. That doesn't make any sense unless the goal is not to allow members of Congress, the representatives of the American people, to ask questions, Schiff said on CNN's Sunday show. Concealing the truth is concealing Russians are again intervening to help the president in his reelection. Where have the Democrats been over the last nearly 4 years now on that claim? Did the Russians interfere in the 2020 election to help Donald Trump? If they did, where's the evidence? They said the same thing in 2016. If that happened, where is the evidence? Oh, it's little troll farms in Cambridge Analytica. What extraordinary election interference. I mean, it's not like they took over the whole system or anything. It's not like they control the voter registries in public-private partnerships with corporations who believe everything is their IP thus providing plausible deniability and a total lack of accountability for both the corporation and the government. It's not like they control all that. It's not like they control the ballot printing and the ballot sending, knowing where all the fake ballots go to voters who are ineligible or moved away or don't exist or never existed in the first place, to all of those illegal aliens. It's not like they know where all those ballots go and can just go pick them up and then bring them back someplace and fill them out and then enter them into the process and make sure that they are counted, because the people counting them are already expecting all of those fake ballots to come in. And it's not like they control the reporting process and the media that reports and sets the tone for the public and then does all of the maintenance on that narrative to make sure the public believes that the thing the media said is true, even when it's impossible, even when it's Joe Biden receiving 81 million real lawful American votes. And it's not like those troll farms in Cambridge Analytica control the lawfare system here in America that makes sure that none of the legitimate election fraud claims can ever be brought to a court and then fully pursued through trial so that the American people can actually have faith in their elections. Russia doesn't have that kind of power, not in the troll farms, not in Cambridge Analytica. And not in whatever the hell Adam Schiff is talking about, and that's why they never check. That's why they never pursue those claims. But you always have to remember, these are the people speaking for the controllers of the system. The system is theirs. It's designed to produce outcomes they like. If you do anything within that system or to that system that will cause that system to produce outcomes they don't like, you are interfering. And the system is set up in such a way that you interfering, quote unquote, makes that a crime. That's the point of the system. But back to Ratcliffe. He's doing the briefings. He's letting the Congress know all of this information in a private environment. And then those members of Congress take that information and run to the media with it, knowing that they can't get in trouble due to the debate clause, or at least believing that. Who knows what it'll look like in the future. But they can say whatever they want, and no one is able to come out and disprove them, of course, because the information is classified. So rather than dealing with that situation with those leakers, Ratcliffe just takes the declassified or unclassified information to the American public. And they cry election interference. That is John Ratcliffe interfering in the 2020 election. It's not Iran interfering. It's not Adam Schiff interfering. It's John Ratcliffe interfering because he brought the claims. Just like they claimed James Comey was interfering in the 2016 election on Donald Trump's behalf by bringing up the Hillary Clinton email issue. It was too close to the election, they said. And Donald Trump has been hearkening back to this on Truth Social over the course of the last week or so, talking about how everything they're doing is now within 60 days of the election. And it's not only within 60 days of November 5th. Today is supposed to be the first day of this election. This is when ballots were meant to begin going out in North Carolina. And next week, other states begin. Now, that's been stopped, at least for now, and we'll get into that later. But we are already well within that period. And everything we are seeing is being presented through the frame of election interference. And it is election interference. We're seeing it across the board. When they mess with employment numbers to make one side look good, that's election interference. That is a government agency controlled by the Uniparty fudging the numbers to benefit Uniparty candidates. Now, that is absolutely insane in a government of, by, and for the people, but we don't have that. And this sort of manipulation has become so commonplace that most people don't even recognize it for what it is anymore. They just think, oh, yeah, this is how politics works. Well, okay, people have said that for their entire lives. Look where we are now. This is what happens if that's how politics works. And every time we settle for that, we make it easier for this to happen. We keep hearing about what the Fed is going to do on interest rates. And we're being presented with those decisions not as smart economic decisions, but political decisions, whether they will help or hurt the Uniparty candidates. And we know why the government agencies would be trying to help the Uniparty candidates, because if they don't win, the government agencies are gone. The Uniparty is the American representative of a foreign entity, the government of the global regime in all of its aspects, we have an occupying foreign force in Washington, D.C. They are not the military. They just command a military. But of course, everything they command is at the behest of someone else, and that someone else, again, is the global regime and its global governing bodies. By the standards used by the Uniparty in 2020, what Merrick Garland did on Wednesday is itself election interference. I've said before that Iran seems to be this cycle's Russia, but it seems like right now they're not prepared to let go of Russia. They've been made to look like fools in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Putin spiked the football and did an end zone dance. He did the icky shake in Mongolia the other day. Just red carpets and magnificent horses with riders adorned in historic costumes. A massive grand display for Vladimir Putin's visit, the visit in violation of an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. Then Merrick Garland blames Russia for election interference, and not 12 hours later, Vladimir Putin comes out and endorses Kamala Harris.
A little trolling. It's called we do a little trolling.
And so naturally today we get this. This is CNN. U.S. sees increasing risk of Russian sabotage of key undersea cables by secretive military unit. The U.S. has detected increased Russian military activity around key undersea cables and believes Russia may now be more likely to carry out potential sabotage operations aimed at disabling a critical piece of the world's communications infrastructure, two U.S. officials told CNN. Russia has put increasing emphasis on building up a dedicated military unit, which deploys a formidable fleet of surface ships, submarines, and naval drones, according to one of the officials. The unit, the, quote, General Staff Main Directorate for Deep Sea Research, end quote, is known by its Russian acronym, GUGI, G-U-G-I. We are concerned about heightened Russian naval activity worldwide and that Russia's decision calculus for damaging U.S. and allied undersea critical infrastructure may be changing, a U.S. official told CNN. Russia is continuing to develop naval capabilities for undersea sabotage, mainly through GUGI, a closely guarded unit that operates surface vessels, submarines, and naval drones. Why can't this official go on record about something like this? This doesn't seem like that big of a deal. Doesn't seem to be classified info. It's just a U.S. official said. And so what are they doing? They're seeding a narrative that Russia will be responsible when the comms go down. Oh, you don't have any internet. Remember how we told you Russia was going to do that? Cutting the undersea cables would make the communications impossible. That would really do damage to the internet. It was on and then all of a sudden it was off. And you are meant to believe, upon observing that, oh yeah, Russia did that. But you know what else could do it? Someone simply flipping off the switch. We saw something very similar in May of 2021 with the Colonial Pipeline. We were told that was a cyber attack. We were told that was malware. It was down for 6 days and then it was back online. We were told that was resolved by the company paying the hackers off in Bitcoin, giving them 75 Bitcoin, which at the time was about $4.5 million. A month later, the Justice Department claimed to have recovered about 64 of those Bitcoins. So the pipeline got shut off. It was malware. It was a cyber attack. The company paid the hackers. Everything turned back on. The hackers were tracked down. And then the FBI got back most of the Bitcoin. So the story has a beginning, middle, and end. It's all wrapped up in a nice little bow. And everybody believes that's how it happened. But it didn't have to happen that way. They could have just simply shut off the switch. And this was the rumor at the time. It was the subject of debunkings and fact checks. And the answer to that claim is apparently just, it didn't happen. They say it didn't happen. There is no evidence. And the FBI said it was a hacker group called DarkSide. Now, is it possible that something like that could happen? Sure, I guess it's possible. There's just no reason to believe it except they say that's what happened. And we're looking at a very similar situation here. They are seeding the narrative that Russia will be responsible for something that has not yet happened. something that seems like it would be rather beneficial to people who already have an explicit, expressed interest in shutting down communications. At some point, the wrong piece of information is going to come out, and shutting communications off completely might be the only way they can stem that tide. And this is what they've attempted to do around the world. And let's just go through a little more of this article. The U.S. regularly tracks Russian ships that patrol close to critical maritime infrastructure and undersea cables, often far from Russian shores, the official said. U.S. concern about the secretive Russian units' undersea operations had not been previously reported. CNN has requested comment from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Undersea cables form a critical backbone of internet and telecommunications traffic around the world. Most communications and internet traffic travels across a vast network of high-speed fiber optic cables installed on the ocean floor. A coordinated attack could significantly disrupt private, government, and military communications along such cables, as well as industries that rely on such communications, including financial markets and energy suppliers. Undersea cables also carry vast amounts of electricity among several European countries. So how about that? If there is any disruption in private, government, or military communications, and that causes problems for industries that rely on those undersea cables, including financial markets and energy suppliers, it's Russia's fault. Russia did it. Russia turned off the electricity. Russia turned off the internet. Russia turned off your access to banking. What would it mean if Russia did all that in just one fell swoop? Well, that would pretty obviously be an act of war, wouldn't it? And hey, Russia's known for doing stuff like this. I mean, that's what this one U.S. official said. They even have their own unit called Googie. You know they're always doing bad stuff on the ocean floor with Googie. I mean, isn't Googie the organization that destroyed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? We were told by people like CNN's Jim Sciutto, the author of this article, that Russia was responsible for that. And it turns out that Russia's not responsible for that at all. If indeed there is a Nord Stream pipeline that blew up, the central narrative has now accepted that it was rogue Ukrainian actors who did it, people who were not controlled by Volodymyr Zelensky. But we do know that all of the Ukrainian actors who are explicitly anti-Russian are controlled by global regime intelligence organizations, including and especially us. Russia literally supplies energy to European nations, and we're being told that Russia might cut undersea cables to make it so that Europeans can't get energy. Sciutto notes specifically that undersea cables carry vast amounts of electricity among several European countries. Jim Sciutto is essentially saying they might have to take the power and the banking and the internet all down at the same time at some point. And at that point, you need to know that Russia did it, because then we're going to say that it was an act of war by Russia, and we are going to need you to back up our war efforts against Russia in retaliation. And in order to do that, we are going to attempt to make you as angry as possible by making the situation as difficult as possible. Now, I don't think this will happen because I don't think they really have the power to make this happen, at least not on a wide scale. But they might have the power to do it in particular places and or for particular times. And it's not that they'll get away with it. It's that they will actually make real people suffer in order to sell the story. So I don't think they're actually going to take the grid down forever or for any long period of time, but they're hinting about what they're going to do, what will happen as a result, the cause for what happened, and who did it. They need to let everybody know that Russia is bad, very bad. Vladimir Putin is a very brutal dictator who launched a very brutal invasion, penetrating the sovereign borders of its very peaceful neighbor that just so happens to be a global regime proxy state waging an ethnic civil war on people of Russian ethnicity on a plot of land that is historically Russian, except when it's in the hands of Khazarians who consider it their ethnic home. The global regime is running out of proxy states. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, released a statement yesterday in response to the DOJ. The U.S. Department of the Treasury has announced the adoption of another package of sanctions against the Rossiya Sigodnia Media Group and some of its subsidiaries, including RT, Ruptly, and Sputnik. These sanctions will affect many of its executives. What will be Russia's response to this aggressive U.S. move? To begin with, these and other U.S. attacks against Russian media outlets, including through the largest U.S. mainstream publications, are the result of operations carefully orchestrated by intelligence services to purge the national and ultimately the global information space of any forms of dissent. These pre-planned actions are obviously designed to create the media background for the implementation of relevant election decisions. The latest round of this witch-hunting campaign is rooted in a desire to push society into permanent stress, infect it with artificial phobias, and create an image of a hidden enemy, assigning this role to Russia. We know that the United States has the technologies for this and has used them many times before with disturbing side effects and consequences. And she's probably talking about events like the Arab Spring and the other color revolutions that have been staged and executed around the world. The main goal of the current administration is to scare, or distract in parentheses, the Americans with a Russian threat and to create an imitation of active work ahead of the elections. When the authorities resort to such primitive methods of influencing voters, it is evidence of the decline of quote-unquote liberal values. As for the U.S. restrictions on our media outlets, Washington has previously imposed numerous stringent restrictions on them, which is further evidence of the irreversible degradation of the democratic state in the United States and its transformation into a totalitarian neoliberal dictatorship. This is our diagnosis for the American administration, which has reduced media outlets to pawns in its inter-party squabbles and is deliberately deceiving the public with allegations about somebody's imaginary interference in quote-unquote democratic processes. Nevertheless, there is high demand for truthful information about global developments provided by RT, Rossiya Sigodnia, and other Russian media resources. Meanwhile, the United States continues to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, infringing on the freedom of information, imposing its views on others, engaging in electoral engineering worldwide, and thereby provoking crises and conflicts with catastrophic humanitarian consequences. The actions of the U.S. authorities, which directly contradict their commitments to the freedom of information and media plurality, will not remain unanswered. We warn once again that any attempt to expel Russian journalists from the United States, create unacceptable conditions for their work, or hinder their professional operation in any other way, including through visa restrictions, will be regarded as grounds for a symmetric and or asymmetric action against American media outlets. And whether all of this is game theoried and scripted to a T, or whether it is all just happening spontaneously in a shared reality, you cannot imagine that the fake and illegitimate Biden administration and all of its tools like Merrick Garland are somehow going to give up their project of attempting to censor what information the American public has access to. So, therefore, at some point, we are very likely to see a Russian response against American media outlets, and you can imagine that will have far more profound implications. Because while our fake and illegitimate administration is beginning to be seen as such, and people understand that the media is just peddling lies all day long, it's easy to understand all of this as rumor mongering to provide a cover story, a Russian scapegoat for all of the things that the uniparty regime in the United States actually wants to do. There's not real hard evidence beneath that, but there is overwhelming evidence at media organizations and tech companies in the United States going along with that fake and illegitimate administration, the uniparty regime in the United States, to censor Americans and to propagandize them. And if the Russians choose to go after our media organizations in any significant way by releasing real information about what they've done, that will actually have a real effect. So we shall see if that happened. But isn't it weird, the world we are in now, where the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is releasing statements like this that are just completely and obviously true at this point. Every accusation they make against this fake and illegitimate regime, the uniparty faction here in the United States, they've done all that. All of those accusations can be substantiated and verified within the central narrative. It's not the stuff of wild conspiracy theories in those dark corners of the internet. It's stuff that's regularly reported about in mainstream outlets. The commies don't hide it. They just pretend it's a good thing when they do it. And on the subject of our government actually censoring the speech of the American people in violation of the First Amendment, on Wednesday, the X Daily account on X, formerly Twitter, posted news. In lawsuit brought by X Corp, the Ninth Circuit rules that California's law requiring large social media companies to submit reports to the Attorney General about their content moderation policies and practices likely violates the First Amendment. Elon Musk highlighted this post saying, "Congrats to the X legal team for defending freedom of speech, the bedrock of democracy." In the court's filing in the case X Corp v. Bonta, the court writes, "The panel held that X Corp was likely to succeed on the merits of its claim that the content category report provisions facially violate the First Amendment. A facial challenge is permissible because the content category report provisions raise the same First Amendment issues for every social media company. The content category report provisions compel non-commercial speech and are subject to strict scrutiny because the provisions are content-based." And so it'll be great to see how that turns out. And every time I see these cases progressing, all I can think is, didn't Donald Trump file class action lawsuits against all of these social media companies, these big tech companies, back in 2021? And the answer is yes. Those three cases against Google, Facebook, now Meta, and Twitter, now X, were moved to California courts. The Twitter case was dismissed on the basis that Twitter is a private company and thus not subject to the First Amendment. He also decided that only California law applies to Twitter. And he ruled that Trump couldn't challenge the constitutionality of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act because he lacked standing to do so. But those excuses are crumbling, and at the point that they do, it won't matter whether the case is in Florida or California. Mark Zuckerberg already admitted to censoring on behalf of the government, working as the government's agent, fulfilling the government's requests. Clarence Thomas has said Section 230 needs to be looked at. What do we think that means? What's going on with these class action lawsuits? I wonder if one day we'll find out. So moving away from the subject of Russia, but sticking with the subject of election interference, let's go to the Detroit news from today. Michigan Appeals Court orders RFK Jr. removed from November ballot. The Michigan Court of Appeals on Friday ordered former independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s name removed from the November ballot. But the Secretary of State's office is taking the fight to the state Supreme Court. The unanimous decision by the appeals court could affect what's expected to be a close presidential race in Michigan and followed Kennedy's appeal of a lower court order that would have kept him on the state's ballot despite his withdrawal from the race and recent endorsement of Donald Trump. While the request was made close to the deadline for defendant to give notice of candidates to local election officials, it was not made so late that latches should apply. The three-judge Court of Appeals panel wrote, referring to a legal doctrine that lets a court deny relief because a claimant delayed making their claim, and latches was the justification for dismissal for many of the lawsuits related to election fraud in 2020. And it's funny because in at least one or two of them, they were issues that had been pursued before the election, only for the courts to determine that the claims were moot because the damages hadn't been incurred yet. So the ruling was that it was too early to bring the case if it was before the election, and then too late to bring the case if it was after, on the very same issue. Additionally, we conclude that the absence of any statutory authority prohibiting his withdrawal gave plaintiff a clear legal right to have his name removed from the ballot. Skipping down, Benson's office, this being Jocelyn Benson, the Soros Secretary of State of Michigan, said last month Kennedy's name would remain on the ballot after he withdrew and endorsed Trump because, under state law, minor party candidates nominated at a state convention cannot withdraw. The New York Post reported on this, as well as the same happening in North Carolina. RFK Jr. will be removed from Michigan and North Carolina ballot, courts rule. Down south, North Carolina's Court of Appeals also sided with Kennedy, and as a result, the state will reprint 130,000 requested mail-in ballots to voters who registered with the We the People Party, which the Kennedy-Shanahan ticket originally formed to gain ballot access in several states. Ballots in the Tar Heel State were supposed to be mailed out by local registrars on September 6th. Obviously, that's today. They also note that in Michigan, the deadline for Jocelyn Benson to send a list of candidates to county clerks is also today, 2 weeks prior to the ballots being sent out. So Jocelyn Benson is going to appeal to the Michigan Supreme Court. We'll see if there's an appeal in North Carolina, and this is still being fought out in Wisconsin. Now, if Kennedy wants to withdraw from the ballot, his name should be taken off. That's pretty simple. But states are fighting him on it. They don't want to take his name off the ballot. Why? Because they anticipated his name being on there, and they planned around his name being on there. Who knows what sorts of changes they have to make at this point with a different ballot? Do the machines have to be changed? Do they then have to go through an updating process, adding additional steps to the criminality of this whole operation? Perhaps we'll see. We talked about the DOJ policy of not doing anything that could be construed as interfering with an election or providing political advantage this close to an election. It was always their policy to err on the side of not doing anything rather than doing something that might interfere with the election. That era is obviously over, and perhaps it should be. But what if the DOJ is not involved? What if it's just Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg up there in New York prosecuting Donald Trump in the fake trial over payments made to Stormy Daniels? That's not the DOJ. I mean, sure, it did include Matthew Colangelo from the DOJ, who was sent up to New York by the fake and illegitimate administration's Attorney General, Merrick Garland, to make sure they brought this case against Donald Trump. But the DOJ is not technically directly involved, according to the rules of people who pretend that reality doesn't exist if the rules don't say that it does. But according to that technicality, the DOJ is actually not involved. Therefore, they are not interfering with the election against DOJ policy. Someone else is interfering with the election. But we got this news this morning, and I can imagine this was a knife through the heart of communists everywhere. Judge delays Trump's sentencing until after the election. Former President Donald Trump will not be sentenced in his New York criminal case until after the 2024 election. Judge Juan Merchan announced Friday, explaining that the decision to delay the sentencing is in part to avoid any appearance of affecting the outcome of the presidential race. So he's making absolutely sure that he won't even look like he's interfering with the election. I mean, convicting Donald Trump for a made-up crime, a crime that could only be prosecuted through the invention of a novel legal theory and could only reach a guilty decision from a jury by telling the jury that it doesn't matter what crime you believe Donald Trump has committed, all you have to do is believe that he committed some crime and that these payments were to cover up that crime before the 2016 election. That is not election interference, but sentencing him on a normal schedule for that crime that is very real. That would be election interference. So now they're going to do it after the election. And man, they thought Donald Trump was going to be in prison during the election. They almost had it. The only thing better than that would be throwing Donald Trump in prison after the election when the country devolves into chaos, battling over the outcome. What will it be? Will Donald Trump win by just a little bit with a uniparty Congress and Senate who can work to undermine him and maybe even disqualify him from taking office? I guess that might be a good time to throw Donald Trump in prison for this crime they made up. We shall see. For now, at least the way it plays in terms of optics and the public narrative, yet another one of the commies' hopes has been dashed. Naturally, Donald Trump responded to this on Truth Social, saying the Manhattan DA witch hunt has been postponed because everyone realizes that there was no case. I did nothing wrong. It is a political attack against me by Comrade Kamala Harris and other radical left opponents for purposes of election interference, and is a case that should have never been brought. Nothing like this has ever happened in the United States of America. It is strictly third world, banana republic, quote unquote, stuff. Importantly, the public understands this, and so does every legal scholar, expert, and luminary, including Andy McCarthy, Jonathan Turley, Alan Dershowitz, Mark Levin, Stephen Calabrese, David Rifkin, Greg Jarrett, Kate and Andrew Cherkasky, Ellie Honig, and many others. I greatly appreciate the words, if necessary, being utilized in the decision, because there should be no if necessary. This case should be rightfully terminated as we prepare for the most important election in the history of our country, make America great again. Trump was also in court today to appeal the decision on the E. Jean Carroll verdict, where a jury decided that there was at least some chance E. Jean Carroll was telling the truth, and therefore everyone gets to call Donald Trump a rapist. Trump gave a brief press conference earlier and said this.
But she made up a story and fabricated 100% that I attacked her at Bergdorf Goodman. You know, it's very interesting. I don't think they were allowed to use this either. Her favorite show is Law and Order. And there's a almost exact story as her story in Law and Order about being attacked in the dressing room of a department store. I don't know if they used the name of the store. But that's her favorite show, Law and Order. She said that.
Now, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you will know that I called the Stormy Daniels case Law and Order New York the loudest hush money, because it's clear that all of it was a television presentation, including and especially the character who ran out in front of the courthouse and set himself on fire. But it turns out that the E. Jean Carroll case is not only part of the Law and Order New York series featuring President Donald Trump, it is also the inspiration for that episode. So we're going to move off of Donald Trump, but stick with election interference and the shaping of election narratives, as we are now only 60 days away from the most important event of all time, the day when Americans go down to their local elementary school cafeteria and press buttons on an iPad attached to a black box, thinking that's going to defeat a 2,000-year-old satanic cult of pedophiles. We used to call that Election Day, but the TV has now told us that you shouldn't think of it as Election Day. You should think of it as the last day to vote and the first day that votes begin getting counted. So just like there's a 2-month-long election period, there could be a 2-month-long post-election period while they're trying to make sure to count each and every one of those real votes perfectly. And by count all the votes perfectly, I mean they're going to wait to announce results until they have the results they want and can reliably feel confident that if anyone checked, they would be able to get away with it. That's what the post-election period is for. Let's go to New York Magazine. This is from yesterday. Could Texas's severe abortion regime help defeat Ted Cruz? We are now being told that Texas, deep red Texas, they've pretended it's actually a purple state for years, but it's not. They just have massive election fraud in Houston and Austin and Dallas and San Antonio. We are being told that Texas, a pro-life state, is about to replace an incumbent Republican who is a very popular national figure despite being an establishment Republican with a virtually unknown Democrat because Texas's abortion restrictions are too severe. Abortion isn't on the ballot, but Texas voters are so worried about abortion restrictions that they are going to vote incumbent Ted Cruz out of office while they vote for Donald Trump for president. That is what we're being told here. Texas, the second largest state, has not elected a Democrat to any statewide office since 1994. No Democrat presidential candidate has carried it since 1976. But the state's so large, important, and most recently diverse, that's illegal aliens, by the way, that Democrats nationally, as well as in the Lone Star State, keep hoping against hope that the next cycle will take down Texas's remarkably arrogant and extremist GOP a notch or two. And Texas's GOP is not that. Texas's GOP is the uniparty right. This is the home state of the Bush dynasty. This is the Texas legislature that tried to destroy Ken Paxton, led by a public drunk named Dade Phelan. Texas is controlled by the uniparty right, and in the cities at least, the same agenda being implemented in California is being implemented in Texas. They're creating global cities and smart cities and 15-minute cities. They have taken over the election apparatus. They've created self-induced energy problems. A state with essentially unlimited energy underground has energy problems because they have been implementing the uniparty agenda in Texas. But in the eyes of communist Ed Kilgore, they're extremist. And if Colin Allred wins his U.S. Senate race in November, becoming the first Democrat to do so since 1988, his party would be delighted. The loser in that scenario would be Ted Cruz, a man who often acts as though there's nothing he can say or do that's too much for Texas. Cruz is the poster boy for the GOP's total surrender to Donald Trump, the man who managed to insult Cruz, his wife, and even his father en route to crushing him in the GOP presidential primary. Now, you might think that having survived a challenge from champion fundraiser Beto O'Rourke in the fine Democrat midterm election of 2018, Cruz would be safe in a presidential year. But then again, Trump's margin in Texas dropped from 9% in 2016 to just over 5% in 2020, shortening his coattails. His opponent, Allred, is a former NFL player who, as the Texas Tribune reported early in the race, strikes quite the contrast to the bombastic incumbent. The article talks about how Cruz was somehow responsible in cultivating the careers of so many federal judges who ended up being appointed by Trump. And just like the Texas GOP, they're all extremists. That's Ted Cruz's fault, according to Ed Kilgore of New York Magazine. And somehow Texas voters are going to punish Ted Cruz for being too strict about abortion. No Republican in Texas would ever consider doing that. The article concludes this way. Perhaps partisan polarization will insulate Cruz from an abortion rights backlash in November. Texas has long been to Democrat hopes like Lucy taunting Charlie Brown with the football. But at a time when Republicans have just assumed the Texas seat is safe, allowing them to concentrate on vulnerable Democrats like Montana's John Tester in their bid to flip the Senate, it would be more than a little interesting if they find themselves instead forced to come to Cruz's aid. So how about that? Abortion is such a powerful issue that it could cost Ted Cruz his Senate seat in Texas. There is no way, in reality, to make that happen. The only way that could happen is through rampant, widespread, systematic election fraud, rigging, and theft. And that is exactly what they intend to have happen. It cannot be made any clearer. The abortion issue is being presented. It is being seated in the narrative as a potential justification and explanation for how Ted Cruz lost in Texas. This is how bad things are going for Democrats in a narrative sense. Abortion is now the only issue that they think they have an advantage on. Everything is being funneled back to abortion. They can release all the polls they want suggesting that American voters really care about this abortion issue and prefer Democrats on the issue. But it's not true. It's just essentially the only place where they still have a clear division. They have to sell the idea that they have the advantage on abortion, because if they don't have an advantage on abortion, then they don't have an advantage on anything. And then it's just down to personalities. And if they can't sell the personalities within the narrative, then they can't even report that they have won elections in any significant way. Now, that said, you have to keep in mind that much of what will look like a loss for Democrats and will be reported as a loss for Democrats is not, in fact, a loss for the uniparty. It's not a loss for the regime. As long as they have a uniparty figure in office, it doesn't matter if it's uniparty left or uniparty right. And to the extent that we will have any quote unquote election and have any of this reporting about who won and who lost, they will probably have to emphasize the success of Republicans in certain places, because the goal above all else is to preserve the election fraud system. They can ride out another 4 years of Donald Trump being publicly recognized as president, or so they think, but there's no way they can ride out their election fraud system being torn down. At that point, the uniparty is over. Let's go to CNN. This is from Wednesday. A blue wall victory is not complete without Omaha's blue dot. The battlegrounds of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania may be pivotal in the race for the White House, but winning those blue wall states alone do not guarantee a campaign victory without something else. Omaha's blue dot. Yard signs with blue circles have begun appearing on lawns across town here, a hopeful symbol for Democrats in a sea of Nebraska red, with one of the state's lone electoral votes likely critical for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump in the closing 2 months of the campaign. It's plausible that we could have a tie, said Jason Brown, who started making the signs last week in a show of his support for Harris. The whole notion of my vote doesn't matter really gets tossed out the window. This could be it. This could be a deciding factor. Nebraska and Maine are the only 2 states that award electoral votes by congressional district rather than by statewide winner. Republicans have long sought to change the law here, so far without success, but for Democrats, it's a point of pride. Barack Obama in 2008 and Joe Biden in 2020 are the party's only 2 candidates to reap a single electoral vote reward. The Harris campaign and its Democratic allies are investing millions here to follow suit. So everyone knows that Nebraska is a typically red state. Those are red state voters. Those are Trump voters. Those are not Democrats in Nebraska. Nebraska is not a Democrat state. But what if they have control of just the cities? And then what if the uniparty agrees that the policy should be, let's divide our electoral votes based on congressional district? And hey, look at that. Some of our congressional districts include the state's cities, Omaha and Lincoln. Well, all you got to do is rig the elections there, and you can get an entire electoral college vote by rigging the elections in a city of only 300,000 people. Now, the blue dot, these signs that are the ostensible impetus for this story being written in the first place, they are meant to be a visual cue for everyone. Remember the blue dot. The blue dot will make you remember that Nebraska has this one electoral college vote that could go for the Democrats. We talked about how they keep saying Texas is going to lose its status as a red state because they've taken over all of the major cities and put their election systems in place. But they need what they do there to override the rest of the state. In Nebraska, all they need to do is rig the elections in a city of 300,000, and that gets them a full electoral vote. And these are the same people who claim that Wyoming should not have 2 senators. And on the subject of split outcomes, this is ABC News from September 3rd. Ticket splitters hold the key to majorities in both chambers of Congress. Wait, what's that? The ticket splitters are going to decide the House and Senate? Man, that's exactly what I proposed, 6 months ago, 9 months ago. When was that? The regime's best case scenario, of course, is to have Donald Trump lose and then install the uniparty everywhere. I'm not disagreeing with that. But outside of that possibility, which they very likely cannot pull off in any narrative sense, they will not be able to convince the country that Donald Trump could have possibly lost. So in that case, would it make sense to have a big steal and get people upset when they're unlikely to believe the results reported by the television and would immediately understand the election's been stolen? Well, no, they have to preserve the election fraud apparatus. So they would allow Donald Trump to have a slim electoral college majority and then fill up the uniparty down ballot in the House, in the Senate, and in the states all the way down to the local level. Trump wins, so all the Trump supporters think the election system worked, and they immediately become less likely to challenge it. They hope that outcome would incentivize them not to challenge it at all, and they might give away races like, I've said many times, Larry Hogan in Maryland. Give them another Republican that will ensure them that the election system must work. That's the only way a Republican could ever win in deep blue Maryland. That would be the regime's ideal outcome if they determine there's no way they can sell a Kamala Harris or whoever replaces her win. But let's see what ABC News has to say about it. Every election cycle, political observers speculate about the power and prevalence of ticket splitters, voters who support one party for president and another in down-ballot races. This year, their influence is unquestioned. They hold the House and Senate majorities in their hands. And how could they possibly know anything like this? They don't know whether people will be ticket splitters, and they don't know how many of them there will be. But let's hear their argument. Given the congressional maps and margins, both chambers are set for flips. In the Republican-controlled House, if Democrat House candidates win every district that Joe Biden won in 2020, the party will regain control there. And if states with Senate races follow the expected presidential results, Republicans will retake the Democrat-controlled upper chamber in November. That leaves the already influential but dwindling tribe of voters willing to split their tickets with a particularly uncommon amount of sway this November, underscoring the unsteady footing Democrats and Republicans hold in Washington and the vast importance of candidates' ability to reach beyond partisan loyalties. And of course, they're framing choosing one side of the uniparty rather than the other side means going beyond partisan loyalties, even though those are essentially the same party. The rest of the article is mostly pointless. They talk about what might make a candidate attractive to ticket splitters, and it's some nonsensical schlock about senators who have been in government for 20 or 30 years, like John Tester and Sherrod Brown, presenting themselves as just like you sort of candidates. They mention California Republican David Valdeo, a Trump impeachment voter, presenting himself as a farmer, real salt of the earth stuff. David Valdeo, the man who voted to impeach Trump, he's just going to tell people he's a farmer, and they're going to be like, hey, man, that's so great. But the point is that the ticket splitting conversation has now gone live. This narrative is in full effect being picked up by mainstream media outlets. And this is Politico from the same day, Tuesday the 3rd. Harris campaign, DNC, announced unprecedented down-ballot spending. Kamala Harris's campaign and the DNC said Tuesday they are sending nearly $25 million to support down-ballot Democrats, an earlier investment and far more money than the top of the ticket has sent in past election years. The funding, in part, reflects the Harris operation's ability to spend money around record fundraising over the past 6 weeks. And all of that is an Act Blue fraud and scam, but we'll leave that aside. But it is also a recognition of the importance of this year's down-ballot races, which overlap with many of the swaths of the country that could decide the presidential election, and whose outcomes will substantially affect how Harris or former President Trump will be able to govern next year. Skipping ahead, the transfers to support down-ballot races are notable both for their timing and large amounts. In 2020, the DNC transferred $5 million to the Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee and $1 million to the Democrat Senatorial Campaign Committee in mid-October, according to filings with the FEC. Earlier money gives the committees more spending options, as common campaign tactics such as hiring staff, taping ads, or printing mailers take time. Harris's campaign and the DNC are positioned to transfer more money this cycle due to a massive surge in fundraising after President Joe Biden dropped out of the race in July. The vice president's ascendancy led both grassroots and big-dollar donors to pick up their giving, and her campaign quickly surpassed Trump's in terms of monthly fundraising and total campaign cash. The transfers also reflect a recognition that achieving many of Harris's stated priorities will require not only keeping the Senate, a difficult task as the party is defending 3 seats in states won by Trump, but also flipping back the House. Of course, strong campaigning from House and Senate candidates could also benefit Harris, as many key races are in states important to the presidential race, such as Arizona and Pennsylvania. Hilariously, at the bottom of this Politico article, it says correction. An earlier version of this report misstated President Joe Biden's title. And how do you imagine they would have misstated President Joe Biden's title? Well, they called him former President Joe Biden. And while you might be inclined to think, well, yeah, that's more accurate. Joe Biden really isn't president anymore, and no one believes he is. It's actually commonplace in the mainstream to talk about how no one knows who's actually running the country. The truth is, Joe Biden was never president, so he can't possibly be former president at any point. History will simply record Joe Biden as the usurper of the presidency in a public stage show of American politics designed to inform the American public about what their government actually is, about what's been done to them and what's been done in their names. But again, on the same day, we have significant mainstream reporting looking to strengthen the narrative position of Democrat candidates down ballot, House, Senate, state and local races. Donald Trump may win the presidency, but people are going to split their tickets, and they're going to do it for abortion or as a result of all this extra spending. That's going to make Trump supporters think, hey, we really need this communist. But before we wrap up, let's think back to the beginning. We're talking about election interference, and we started discussing whether or not claims about election interference themselves actually constitute election interference. That's what the Democrats claimed in 2020, and now they're the ones making claims about foreign interference in our elections, interference from violent MAGA extremists, interference because of mis and dis and malinformation at the behest of these foreign entities, at least sometimes. So they have already reversed their position, and they may have reversed their position into a far worse position. Because if all of that stuff constitutes election interference, and they're doing all that stuff, then they are making the case against themselves for the future. They are describing what it means to be guilty of election interference and in coordination with foreign entities. And they're making it clear that that includes media figures who are attempting to bias the public through the dissemination of disinformation. And I'm not sure that's a great idea for the people who are actually doing it. I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.